So I just want to thank everyone for joining today. My name is Derek Timm. I'm a registered dietitian, as well as I have a background in dietary fiber from the University of Minnesota, where I did both my undergrad as well as my graduate work. And I currently work for Regular Girl. And the title of my presentation today is Dietary Fiber and IBS, the Benefits and Pitfalls of Supplementation. And this is going to really focus in on dietary fiber primarily, and a little bit more about myself for those that don't know you. Dietary fiber is very near and dear to my heart. I started studying dietary fiber 15 years ago already, which is kind of crazy to think about. So something that I'm very aware of, and it's been fun to see it grow in both interest from a scientific perspective, as well as even consumer interest in the last 15 plus years. I've done a lot of work in this area. I have 18 published studies, and the most of those are actually in dietary fiber. So it's something that I keep up on and really, really love to talk about. So I'm happy to share more information. And then also, I went through the course through Monash University to learn more about the low FODMAP dietary program that I'm going to be doing a lot of speaking about today. So next slide. So I don't really know where everyone's background is on fiber, and sometimes I talk as if I know a lot more than everyone else. I really wanted to take a couple slides here in a couple of minutes to really kind of get a good foundation of everyone's knowledge on dietary fiber before we really go into the meat of the presentation. So sort of my definition of dietary fiber is like plant components that are indigestible in the small intestine. So that's essentially what it is. And then what it does once it gets to large intestine largely is going to result in what the benefits are. So since most of us are in the US, I really want to focus on what the FDA official definition is. And it's a little bit cumbersome, so I will not read it all, but I wanted to really highlight a few of the important parts. It's going to be non-digestible, soluble, and insoluble carbohydrates of 3 monomeric units or more. There are a few fibers that are shorter that don't get covered in this definition, but most of it is larger carbohydrates that are indigestible, and they are intrinsic and intact in plants. So what they mean by that is fiber that's in a apple or celery or beans. So that's kind of the first part of it. The second part of their definition is isolated or synthetic non-digestible carbohydrates. So these would be fiber that would be added into a food or into a supplement. And with these type of fibers, they have an extra layer of evidence they need to in order to call it and or label it as a dietary fiber on the label. And this is where they need to have physiological effects that are beneficial to human health. And I'm going to speak about that in a couple more slides in more detail. So next slide. So there's a lot of different classifications of dietary fiber that you may or may not be aware of. Most people have heard or know of, insoluble fiber and soluble fibers. So those you see labeled on the nutrition facts panel. And really that's the old way of looking at it. It's whether or not it's soluble in water or not. And that is helpful for generalizations, but it doesn't necessarily dictate the benefits completely. So at least within the research community, we've been kind of trying to move away from that a little bit. But you will still see that, and a lot of consumers maybe are aware of that, where they will ask for one versus the other. So another way of looking at it at fibers is, are they fermentable or not? And most of the fermentation that occurs is in the large intestine, and that can be very beneficial. So some of the breakdown products of fiber fermentation in the large intestine are short chain fatty acids, most notably acetate, propionate, and butyrate. Butyrate is the one of most interest for gut health in general because it's the main fuel for the colonic epithelial cells. So essentially giving them food is going to keep them healthy and functioning well, and that kind of has implications in gut barrier, most notably. But one of the negatives of fermentation of fiber is the gas production that occurs. And depending on the fiber, the amount and rate of the gas production really has major implications in IBS, because that gas has to go somewhere. It's either going to stay in the gut and cause bloating and discomfort, or it's going to have to come out, and that could occur as flatulence, which nobody wants to have that either. So this is a big deal. And then kind of prebiotic versus not. I'm going to talk about that specifically in a little more detail in the rest of the presentation, but it's selectively utilized fibers by the gut microbiome, and that usually has health benefits associated with it. So next slide. So I already spoke about how the FDA changed the fiber rulings. This occurred in 2016, and we're still kind of dealing with the aftermath of this ruling. They really changed the fiber labeling from purely analytical. So you could, run a food or an isolated fiber through an analytical test, and you get a number of grams of fiber per weight. Okay, in the past, you could just label that in the nutrition facts or supplement facts of products, not a problem. Since this ruling requires non-intact fibers, so isolated fibers, to have proven benefits, we've really moved and increased the requirements in a positive way. It might not make every fiber qualify, but I think that this is better for the consumer as well as formulators in the industry. So what are these benefits? There's actually 6 of them. A few of them are very classic benefits of fiber that most people are aware of, like lowering postprandial glucose levels, decreasing cholesterol, promoting laxation, frequency of bowel movements. Those are all very classic terms that we're all aware of, and that's good. A few of them are a little less well known. Lowering blood pressure, that's not a very common effect of fiber, and fiber doesn't have a large magnitude of an effect on it, but it can have a positive benefit there. Also, increasing mineral absorption. That's something that most consumers maybe aren't aware of, and the reason for that is mostly due to the fermentation of fiber in the gut. The short-chain fatty acids that I spoke about earlier actually decrease the pH of the colon, which better solubilizes minerals such as calcium, which are then better absorbed into the system and have implications for anything from osteoporosis to just general nutritional status of these minerals. So that's a good thing. And then reducing energy intake as well. Most people think of it as satiety, which is generally a more acute measure of feelings, but then satiety is good, but you also need to have the decrease in food consumption that results of feeling more full or less hungry. And that's something that's a little bit harder to prove in the short term. But if you think about, a lot of the epidemiological studies show that people who consume more fiber tend to either have a lower body weight or have a lower weight increase over a time frame of 5 years, 10 years, etc. So it's definitely a great benefit of consuming fiber. Next slide. So we talked about what are the health benefits of fiber. Well, the FDA originally in 2016 looked at fibers that either already had qualified health claims, such as beta-glucans and psyllium, or just the general literature for various fibers, and they made a self-assessment of which ones are approved. Guar gum was one of those, cellulose, pectin, locust bean gum, as well as methyl cellulose. So those were things that the FDA approved. Since that ruling, manufacturers of various fibers have been able to submit their scientific evidence to the FDA for them to review and determine if a fiber gets approved or doesn't get approved. And since then, there's been quite a few fibers that have actually been added to the list, and it's a continuing process. So if new fibers are discovered and used, eventually they can submit to the FDA and get approved. Of the list on the right that I really want to highlight is the inulin and fructooligosaccharides, or FOS. That's a big one. The galacto-oligosaccharides, or GOS, polydextrose, resistant maltodextrins, and acacia gum are some of the ones we'll really be talking about in terms of IBS here in the future. So next slide. So talked about all the benefits of fiber, how great it is. So how much do you need per day? Obviously, there are some differences you see when you look at the DRI values, and it's mostly broken down by age as well as sex. You can see that women tend to have slightly lower fiber recommendations, and that's just based upon energy recommendations, since that's generally, the fiber is gauged based on energy intake. It's actually 14 grams per 100 or 1,000 kcals is sort of how they go about it. And then you can see children on the bottom there is quite a lot for anyone that deals with pediatrics. Children can be fussy, they might not eat a lot. So it's really eye-opening to see how high of a level of 19 grams a day, 25 grams a day for a school-age child is. And I didn't put it on the slide, but the new daily value for dietary fiber is 28 grams per day. So it kind of splits the difference between what you see with the males and females. And if anyone's interested, the average intake of dietary fiber in the US is approximately 14, 15, 16 grams, somewhere in that area. So you can see we have about a 10 gram per day fiber deficit just in the general population. And there's lots of reasons for that, but we'll talk about that in more detail in the next, later in the presentation. So I kind of wanted to shift gears here and go into prebiotics. So essentially what prebiotics are food components that have health benefits to us via the modulation of the gut microbiome. One of the new organizations out there that has a really good definition, and they're trying to standardize that, because if you look in the old literature, you'd have each research group had a slightly different definition, but now we really have a good one that started in 2017 is when this was actually published, but they said it's a substrate that is selectively utilized by the host microorganisms. So they didn't even just say bacteria, that also includes fungi, yeast, other things that are in the gut, and then conferring a health benefit. So it's not just talking about is it fermented or not, it also really talks about this health benefit. And we'll go about that in a little bit more detail. But before that, I really wanted to kind of show what the different prebiotics can be that maybe aren't things you always think about, because you hear this term thrown about quite a bit. And you can look and see, they have this sort of decision tree here showing, is it selectively utilized by the host microorganisms? Okay, if that is true, yes, it's a prebiotic. If it's not, then it's not a prebiotic. But looking down, you can see, CLA, which is actually a fatty acid, is classified as a prebiotic, and there are some that actually do that and modulate the gut microorganisms, which is something that you don't always think about. You always think of fiber as the primary one. So I just wanted people to be aware of that. But you can see, a lot of oligosaccharides, FOS, inulin, GOS, some of the things we're going to talk about in the context of IBS are actually, pretty strong prebiotics. And then lastly on this, I wanted to focus on the middle, where you can see that, dietary fibers can and can't be, prebiotic, depending on, sort of how fermentable they are and which microorganisms ferment them. So this is kind of a good reference. So moving on to the next slide, some of the health benefits of the prebiotics, based on the ISAPP sort of definitions. I wanted to kind of highlight a few here that go beyond the classic health benefits that the FDA noted. And this is, inhibition of pathogens. So some of these prebiotic bacteria can compete for space within the gut and kind of box them out, using a basketball analogy, so that they can't grow. That's one thing. They also produce compounds that might actually kill some of the other bacteria in there that could be bad, or through the fermentation of fiber can decrease the pH, and some of the pathogens can't tolerate that lower pH, so it actually will inhibit them. So that's all good benefits. Also, there's a lot of immune stimulation that can occur at the gut level. It's estimated that 60 to 70% of our immune function is actually at the gut level. So being able to stimulate that can be quite powerful as kind of we'll call it first line of defense before any pathogens can get into the body. And then you see some of the classic things here: cardiometabolic, increase in mineral absorption. I've already spoken with those on those. And then just kind of improving gut health. I kind of touched on that earlier, where producing the short chain fatty acids and butyrate really helps with just gut health in general, which is just, it's hard to measure, but it's very, very beneficial. So moving on to IBS, I think that's why most of us are here today, and it's IBS Awareness Month. So we really wanted to talk about this in more detail. Next slide. So IBS is one of several functional GI disorders that you'll see, and they sort of clump together and overlap quite a bit. So I wanted to kind of just highlight that this can be, chronic laxation problems, whether it be constipation or diarrhea. It can be functional pain or bloating that you'll see with people. And I think one of the main things I want to point out too is this visceral hypersensitivity. Somebody that doesn't have a GI disorder, can just tolerate so much more gas in the digestive tract, where somebody with visceral hypersensitivity, a little bit of gas is going to trigger this pain or bloating feeling so much more easily, so that they're just have more sensitive stomach. So this really plays into it. And then IBS, anyone that has it or knows somebody that has it, it's a kind of a tough diagnosis to get. It's sort of almost a exclusionary diagnosis in many ways, and there's I don't want to go on a lot of the weeds on diagnosis, but it's a big problem, and I'll talk about that a lot later on in our presentation. So moving on. So just a little bit of facts about some of these GI disorders. They actually affect more females than males, so that's just something to be aware of and know. Cause a huge decrease in quality of life, which is a huge bummer, whether it's urgency to go to the bathroom, so you really need to know where a bathroom is at all times, like that's a huge problem, or just any of this chronic pain and bloating. It's just making somebody just uncomfortable all the time on a chronic basis. It really, really weighs on you, which can really feed into the decreased work productivity that you see with people with IBS. If you're not feeling well, you're probably not going to perform as well. And I mean, it all makes sense, but it's just something to want to call out. And then also, healthcare costs of this, and getting a diagnosis and seeing specialists, whether it be a dietitian or a GI and everything, it's really can add up quite a bit, and can be a barrier for some folks. So moving on. So I don't know how familiar people are with the low FODMAP diet, but it's something I really wanted to give you a little bit of background on and go into a lot of detail on, because it can really help the symptoms of people that have IBS. And this is it's a dietary management program. I know we say diet quite a bit, but it's not a weight loss diet. And I think that kind of diet has that connotation for people. So it's really something I try to stress. It's a dietary management program. And that's actually, I know quite a few of the researchers at Monash University that developed it, and they really stress that as well. And I encourage anyone talking with patients or friends about it, it's a dietary management program. I really want to stress that. And really what FODMAP is a acronym that was coined by them, and they essentially grouped a lot of poorly tolerated dietary ingredients that we've known about for 20, 30, 40 years, and clumped them all together and really started looking at what the benefits are of trying to exclude these, or identify which ones are a negative for people. And their dietary program really has 3 phases I'm going to talk about in more detail, but it's really trying to figure out what are your individual triggers or foods that cause problems. And knowing about what they are, but then which ones trigger symptoms for that individual person, because two people with IBS could get triggered by 2 completely different FODMAPs. So that's really something we'll go through in more details. So FODMAP is not my favorite acronym that's ever been developed, but I'm going to teach you how to know what it is and what that means. So it is fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So fermentable are going to be primarily rapidly fermented carbohydrates. Not that not all fermented fibers are rapidly fermented and cause problems. So that's really, there's a nuance there to understand. And inulin or fructooligosaccharides are really the more common ones that people think about and talk about. And then oligosaccharides, meaning 6 to 10 monomeric units. So these are small short chain fibers. That's going to be your FOS and GOS. And for those that don't know what GOS is, that's primarily found in beans and legumes. So if you're ever eaten too much of those, you know why, and it's really the GOS in there that's causing the problems. The disaccharide that we're concerned about is lactose. So obviously there's a fair amount of the population that does not have or has limited production of the lactase enzyme that breaks that down in milk. So what will happen is that lactose, rather than getting digested in the small intestine, is going to get in the large intestine, where the bacteria are going to rapidly ferment it and consume it, and that's going to cause the gas, bloating, diarrhea that we see with lactose intolerance. For monosaccharides, we're primarily focused on fructose because there is malabsorption of fructose, and the key here is that it's not just that a food contains fructose, that it contains more fructose than glucose, and that's how they really test for this. So things that have high fructose content, like honey or high fructose corn syrup, are going to be the problems. And then polyols. So I've seen quite a bit of an increase in sugar alcohols in various products, and I think this is somewhat of a direct result of the added sugar ruling that is kind of a tangent a little bit, but people are trying to get away from sugars or added sugars. They're adding more polyols and sugar alcohols, which do have that sweetness which people desire, and less calories, which is good. However, they tend to be malabsorbed and cause a lot of gas and bloating in people, especially if they're consumed in high amounts. So that's kind of something I always look for in a lot of low sugar products or keto, paleo, those sort of things. You gotta kind of look out. Maybe not paleo, but definitely keto. You got to look out for these sugar alcohols because they tend to be really high in those kind of products. So I told you what they are, but why are they a problem? So especially some of them have an osmotic effect. So they're basically going to draw water into the small intestine, and that can cause some problems in distension. That's more from the lactose, fructose, as well as the polyols. Obviously, they're going to be, some of these are also going to be fermented, so they can also cause a lot of gas, and that's going to be a huge problem for people. It's a lot of they kind of overlap quite a bit, but a lot of the fermentation and gas can be come from rapidly fermented fibers as well. So moving on. So how do you avoid FODMAPs or even identify what they are? I think that's really the key, is because if you look on a list, I actually print out a list and have it with me at all times to really kind of know what products are high in them and what are low in them. And I think the biggest key to know is it's the dose of FODMAPs, not necessarily the presence of them. That's the bigger issue, because as we know from many places, the dose equals the effect. So there are foods that contain FODMAPs that are acceptable for people, and there's also times where consuming maybe a whole apple causes people problems. Okay, what's a half of an apple or a quarter an apple might be more tolerated, so that's something to really look at, is portion size as well. And actually, Monash University has a great application you can download from an app store that actually has a great stoplight approach. So it has a red light, don't consume, a yellow light, maybe the dose, and then a green light. So I think that can be really helpful for patients as well as practitioners to be aware of, because it's a great reference to have. So moving on. So the low FODMAP dietary protocol, as I mentioned before, it has 3 phases, and this is something that really any patient should be utilizing a dietitian that is aware of this and or trained in this, because there is a lot to know and a lot of nuances, and it needs to be done in a very thoughtful way. Otherwise, it's not really going to be beneficial. So the first phase is just going to be eliminating all potential FODMAPs from the meal. Well, a new patient may have absolutely no idea what a FODMAP is and what foods tend to be high in FODMAPs. So obviously you need to be able to impart that knowledge upon them. And then the second phase is the reintroduction phase. So this is a very thoughtful approach of screening which FODMAPs cause problems by introducing them very slowly. And I have a couple slides here where I'll really talk about how to look at each individual FODMAP. And then the third phase is just the maintenance phase of really, after you identified what FODMAPs are a problem for you, trying to add as many other FODMAPs and to get as much diversity in the diet as possible. So moving on. So you look at the reintroduction phase. There are certain foods and quantities of these foods that you can really test, for 3-day periods to see if they trigger symptoms or not. And that's really what we're looking for. And having a diary to really write down and track this is going to be very important. Looking at excess fructose, honey I already mentioned as something that's really high in fructose. A mango is another just classic example of something that you can do. Do that for a couple days, only do one FODMAP at a time, maybe have a washout period, and then you can start with the next one. And that could be, looking for is lactose, but that is something people probably know by this point in their life if they have lactose intolerance, but you never know. It could be something to look at. But yeah, and there's also some of those sugar alcohols like sorbitol and mannitol. There's sort of foods that are higher in these than others. So, whether it's, avocado or apricot for sorbitol, mushrooms for mannitol. And then you can look at even multiple FODMAPs at the same time. There's certain foods that are high in fructose and sorbitol. After you've maybe identified them before, you can see if the combination works. So next slide, I have a few more examples. So looking at if fructans or FOS is a problem, that tends to be high in wheat. So you could do, whole wheat pastas, things like that. Also, some of the more classic things that cause people problems, or most frequently, are going to be like onion and garlic, actually. And there's products out there that are low in these, or only extract the, kind of do an oil extraction, so you don't have a lot of the soluble fibers from it, and try to give you that that flavor without the symptoms. Then GOS, I mentioned earlier, a lot of legumes, lentils, chickpeas, other beans tend to be high in GOS. You can kind of test that. So moving on. So after you've, kind of identified which FODMAP or FODMAPs really cause problems, you really just want to add in all other things and just let them know, like, just understand that just because these are trigger foods, you may be able to consume a little bit of it. And sometimes, if you're at a social gathering and whatnot, you might want to avoid it. But at other times, if you can tolerate it and you want to, eat a certain food, it might be your favorite food. I love mangoes personally. If I couldn't have mangoes, I'd be a little sad, but I might have it once in a while. And that's okay. It's just really understanding that this might trigger some symptoms. And one of the drawbacks of the whole low FODMAP approach is, especially in the elimination phase, and depending on what FODMAP is a problem in the maintenance phase, is a lot of these are dietary fibers and or prebiotics that promote the good bacteria in your gut, whether it be the bifidobacteria, the lactobacilli bacteria, and you might be lacking in those. And there's actually scientific studies that have shown in the elimination phase you do have a decrease in these good groups of bacteria. So it's something you don't want to do long term. And you could potentially look at supplementing a fiber in there that's a prebiotic and a low FODMAP to help compensate for the decrease in these good bacteria. So there are some contraindications for this approach, and I really stressed it once already, but I want to say it again. This is not a weight loss diet, and try to really say it's not that, and it's really a dietary management system. Try to even eliminate the diet talk anyways, and I notice I'm saying that myself, as I'm so used to doing that, but it's something where we really have to use our words carefully. And also, this is to manage the symptoms of IBS. This doesn't really target any of the underlying symptoms or causes of it. That's just kind of one thing that I want to stress. Also, anyone that has a history of eating disorders probably shouldn't go on the low FODMAP diet because it's so restrictive and it can be a trigger for some of these underlying conditions. And then obviously long term, if you're restricting groups of foods, poor nutritional status can certainly come out. And also, if somebody is already having poor nutrition status, it might not be the best decision to even go about this approach. So moving on. So does this approach help? And I think there's a lot of studies that have looked at it, and yes, I really just pulled out just this meta-analysis chart to show you that, like, for abdominal pain, it showed quite a good improvement in decrease in abdominal pain for patients. And I could have went through 5 slides here, but I didn't really want to kill you with too much science and too many graphs, but I just want to show, like, it does work. And I know quite a few people that have done it personally and really have reaped the benefits of it. So moving on. So I spoke about one potential solution of helping supplement that fiber that may be lost either in the short term in the elimination phase or long term on the maintenance phase. So there are a lot of good supplements on the market for everyone, but people with IBS specifically may want to avoid ones that are known to be high in FODMAPs. Some of those are, wheat bran or wheat dextrin. If you were to look on a shelf, that's kind of your base Benefiber product that you see in many drugstores and big box stores. Other things to look for are inulin and fructooligosaccharides. Those are very high in FODMAPs. That causes problems for most people that don't even have IBS. So if you have IBS, it's even going to be more pronounced. They tend to not be in too many fiber supplements that you see in big box stores, but some of the some products will have them. Also, they're in a lot of foods, and they may not be labeled as inulin or fructooligosaccharides. It might be labeled as chicory root or chicory root extract, Jerusalem artichoke. There's other ways of labeling it that are kind of keywords for that to kind of be aware of. Galacto-oligosaccharides, not a ton in supplements, but there are some that will have that in them. And then xylo-oligosaccharides, that's something that is kind of a newer fiber on the market that I do see in some supplements, but it's also not a FDA approved fiber, so it's not likely to be found in foods, so it'd be more of a supplement thing. And these are all things that Jane Muir outlined and talked about, and she's one of the leading scientists at Monash University, really kind of highlighted these. So moving on to what can you use that are low FODMAP fibers, and they may or may not have the certification, but partially hydrolyzed guar gum or guar fiber, that's was actually the first fiber that was certified low FODMAP by Monash University. Psyllium is another one that is low FODMAP. I don't know if it's certified, but it definitely is low FODMAP. So that would be your Metamucil. So that's pretty common as both a brand name as well as a generic fiber supplement. Methylcellulose, that is your Citracel. You might see it as generics as well. That's low FODMAP. And those two, psyllium and methylcellulose, they're not really fermented very heavily, so that's why they're low FODMAP. And then acacia gum, that was recently approved as a fiber, and you don't see it in a lot of supplements, but it's definitely something out there that's low FODMAP. And then Caria gum, I've honestly never heard of it, and that could be something that's popular in Australia or other places, but that's not something I've seen in a ton of different supplements, but it's something that was explicitly mentioned as low FODMAP. So I work for Regular Girl, and the fiber that we use in our supplements is Sunfiber. So I really want to just kind of speak to why we use it and why it's important. It's a prebiotic dietary fiber that, we have over 100, there's like 180 published research articles on it, including a lot of human clinical evidence. There's over 120 out there to date. And, it's a soluble fiber, which is really nice because it dissolves completely clear in liquids without really having a taste or a texture. If you've consumed like a Metamucil or a Citracel, you know that it kind of gels up, and that's fine, but it tends to not be enjoyable to consume, and I think a lot of people are turned off by that. So this is nice because Sunfiber doesn't have that, and it's also low FODMAP. It was actually the first low FODMAP fiber that was certified by Monash University. You know, and it, you know, something that's organic, it's non-GMO, it's gluten-free. So there's a lot of good auxiliary things about it. And it's also something that's, you know, safe. It's actually been used in enteral formulas for about 30 years now. So it's something with a long history for use in other people that maybe are outside of IBS patients, but just in general, you know, looking at vulnerable populations, people that like it. So, you know, products that contain Sunfiber, of course, are our regular girl line of supplements. You know, that's going to contain the Sunfiber as well as a probiotic that's Bifidobacterium lactis. And we have several different ways of consuming that. You either have as a bulk powder or as stick packs. So that's good. And then if you're just looking for the Sunfiber itself, there's Tomorrow's Nutrition Sunfiber, and that's just the Sunfiber by itself, no probiotics. And then if you know any male clients that want a symbiotic product, the prebiotic plus the probiotics, but don't really want the you know, very female-centric packaging, the Sunfiber GI is sort of that. It's basically a very similar formula, but it's in gender-neutral packaging. So I've covered a lot of ground today, and I really wanted to leave plenty of time for us to have, you know, a Q&A session, because I didn't want to just give you information without answering your questions, because there are a lot of different areas that may have questions. So you can probably do that through chat. That might be the best way to go about it. Okay, so I see some questions coming in here. Is there a specific time that you should consume these, like first thing in the morning or before a meal? I personally consume in the morning, and that's just sort of part of my routine. I think it's just, you know, that's something that's good to do. Also, you could consume it before a meal, because usually fibers can induce that satiety effect we talked about earlier as sort of a preload to a meal. So it might help with, especially if you're looking to, you know, kind of do for weight management, but it also can control blood glucose attenuation. So it might lower that glucose spike after a meal. Can Sunfiber cause bloating? I see coming in. Generally speaking, for most people, no. But, you know, everyone's different. And, you know, if you have extreme visceral hypersensitivity or you have a really sensitive stomach, it may, but in general, it's pretty well tolerated with everyone. I mean, that's why it was certified by Monash University. And there's also at least 8 different human studies that looked at IBS patients, both adults as well as children. And it really showed an improvement in abdominal pain and bloating. So that's really something specifically that tends to be good at. So, what dose to start with? So, you know, like for regular girl, it has 6 grams per day. That's really what we formulated it with. And that's because that's the dose that's most commonly shown to have benefits in the literature. But especially if you have an IBS patient that is concerned about, you know, hey, I've tried different fibers before, they've always caused me problems, you could start it at a half dose. So either a half a scoop or a half a sachet. That's really not a bad idea to do that for about a week to 2 weeks. And then maybe if they're happy with the benefits at that, you could keep it at the half dose, or if they want to at least try the full dose, the 6 grams, do that. And if they continue to have no problems, stick with it. If they do have, you know, symptoms and they don't like it, they could try to bring it back down to a half dose. Okay, so I'm just going down the list. So I see, what about raw salads? I used to really like them, but it seems like they cause bloating. Without salads, I get constipation. What's the best way to strike the balance? So, you know, you're saying raw salads. I would really try to think about what's all in that salad. If it's just lettuce or spinach or mixed greens, you know, that could be something where maybe try to do them in isolation and see if a particular subtype whether it's the spinach is causing problems versus the mixed greens. Could also look at what you're adding to it. I mean, I frequently add carrots, radishes, walnuts, sometimes cheese for a little bit of protein, or an egg, kind of add and subtract different things for a couple days in a row and see if that helps out with bloating, because it could be not just the salad, it could be the things you're adding to the salad that are causing problems. And if that doesn't work, maybe cut down on the size of the salad. Maybe if you had a big salad, maybe cut down on the size. And you could look at, adding other high fiber things in your diet. I'm assuming you're consuming a salad for lunch. Maybe you do a higher fiber cereal or oatmeal or something in the morning, or you do a smoothie and maybe add, supplemental fiber to that. There's other ways to get fiber in the diet, not just add in a salad. So moving on to the next question is, how would you compare Regular Girl to like a gummy fiber supplement from the drugstore? Gummies are great for compliance. I'm not a huge fan of gummies in general, only because they tend to add a fair amount of calories and sugar to the one's diet. I mean, first and foremost. Also, you need to look at what fiber is in the gummy and the dose. So I didn't talk about it earlier, but I actually used to work at Nature Made. That was actually my first job, and I helped formulate the fiber gummies that we used there. They, I believe, used inulin, but we were only able to get a gram or two of inulin per gummy. So if you're only consuming 2 gummies, you might not be getting a lot of fiber. So that's where something that's maybe a powder might be more fiber for your calorie or sugar, but also also if it's inulin like they use there, like that's a high FODMAP fiber that's most likely going to cause some problems, especially if you want to get 6, 8, if you're trying to do that fiber gap at 10 grams of inulin or a high FODMAP fiber will cause most people, distress, regardless of IBS status or not. So moving on to the next question. I shared Regular Girl with my new GI doc, and I was seen, and she looked up and said it would increase my symptoms. It's certainly, something where, each individual doctor is going to have its own, thought and perspective on things. I mean, there is some research out there under PHGG or guar fiber or galactomannan fiber. There's different ways it's in the literature. So he or she may not have seen all the literature, but also one of the nuances of Sunfiber is it is a fermentable fiber. So it's just not as rapidly fermented as something like an inulin or a FOS, which are really known to be high FODMAPs and cause problems. So it's something where, trying it, we oftentimes do some sampling so you could at least try it first and then see how it works for you. Because some people might not tolerate it, but being able to at least try it will make you feel better before you go and purchase it. I'm at the end of the questions that have come in. So if you have any more questions, feel free to ask. We do have a few more minutes left. So I can kind of give you a little bit of time, but I do want to, take the opportunity to thank you all for joining today and give me the opportunity to share my knowledge, my passion for fiber and FODMAPs. I hope I covered some information and taught you something new, and really like to do this. No, you're welcome, Aaron. No, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this session today. Okay. So I generally say no. Um, Prebiotics themselves do not have a recommended daily level or anything like that. There's no formal recommendation. So there's nothing to really base saying more on. Certainly, if people wanted to, there's no reason you couldn't. But the 6 gram dose is pretty solid. It definitely increases the bifidobacterium levels. Also helps out with laxation, helps out with diarrhea, constipation. So there's really a lot of good reasons there. There's so in short, I would say no. But if you have it already, you're getting regular girl or had a different fiber and you wanted to try it, by all means. But I also don't want people to spend too much money on supplemental products if you're not really noticing a benefit. Okay, so I see a few more things that came in. So I see polydextrose and sorbitol. Are those good fibers? So sorbitol is a sugar alcohol. That definitely is a high FODMAP fiber, or high FODMAP, not fiber, but high in FODMAPs. I think for what it is in products, if the dose is fairly low, it's not a problem. So I think it's good because it helps reduce the glycemic index of foods. It's lower in calories. I think there's definitely benefits of it. It's just a matter of if you have an IBS and you consume something with sorbitol and it causes problems, well, then it's bad. I don't really like to, I tend to take a balanced approach of like, you really need to know the exact situation. Polydextrose, I actually had on my list of fibers to talk about, but I really didn't see a lot of good information on if it was definitively high FODMAP or low FODMAP. The one thing about it is it's actually produced via like a weird kind of chemical process. So it's not like a naturally occurring fiber. So I tend to like not love that, but also at the same time, full disclosure, I studied polydextrose effects on laxation in grad school, and it did show a benefit for laxation at a 20 gram a day dose. So I don't have a good or a bad answer on that. It's just, it kind of depends on what you're looking to do. So I see another question about what about vitamins? Do you see some patients being sensitive to those? When you say vitamins, I'm going to assume you mean like a multivitamin and mineral. So in terms of FODMAPs, it's going to be kind of not applicable. It's not a problem there. But like if you were to consume a multivitamin on an empty stomach, the minerals in there tend to cause digestive upset. Just give you a stomach ache. So I always recommend people take a vitamin after a meal and a fairly sizable meal, because myself, I will almost get nauseous if I consume a multivitamin without that. I was gonna say. So I'm seeing what is the benefit of regular girl versus seed prebiotic or probiotic product? I mean, in terms of delivering a prebiotic and a probiotic, the nice thing about regular girls, it's all in one, and it tends to be a little bit more affordable than if you're to buy, especially a brand name probiotic. Those tend to be quite expensive. And then the prebiotic, it just kind of depends on what prebiotic you're talking about. If it's something that's high FODMAP or something, and the thing is high FODMAP or low FODMAP, it matters in the context of IBS. But if the person doesn't have IBS, they are definite prebiotics and they help with the gut microbiome. So I'm not going to say do consume it or not. But the nice thing about regular girl and Sunfiber, I didn't want to elaborate too much off topic, but we do have a lot of evidence for not only laxation, prebiotic benefits, but there's satiety benefits, blood glucose benefits, cholesterol. There's a little bit of data there. So it kind of goes beyond the digestive space and a lot of other things where it can be beneficial, where depending on the specific probiotic or prebiotic, it may not have as much evidence. And that's just a generalized statement. If you had a specific product, compare and contrast, and you had time, it could give a more definitive answer. So I've seen a few more questions coming in. If someone has tried the FODMAP program and it didn't notice a major issues with any of the food categories, do they actually have IBS? That's a great question. I think that kind of goes beyond my knowledge and scope. That could go into more like diagnoses and things where a GI could give a better answer. But in terms of symptoms, that would just mean that the FODMAPs themselves aren't triggering symptoms. It doesn't mean that they don't have issues, because IBS has basically 4 different categories. You have constipation predominant, diarrhea predominant, and mixed are kind of like the 3. And then there's a 4th one that is less important, but they just might have somebody that has, chronic constipation or diarrhea because of other reasons, and it could be completely unrelated to FODMAP. So I think that that's a great question. Is this the low FODMAP dietary program isn't the catch-all, be-all for every person, every IBS patient? So I got another question that came in. What is good time of the day to consume prebiotic supplements? I like to do it in the morning, and just give yourself time to, you're going to be consuming with other foods throughout the day, and just kind of keep it with your gut. I mean, you could take it right before bed, but sometimes, people consume dietary fibers and they may have to go to the bathroom soon. So taking it too late in the day, if that affects the person that way, you might not want to have to get up in the middle of the night, or might not want to have stomach upset or anything like that at night. So doing it during the day could be good. But if you're somebody who has symptoms, and your day, if you're going to be out and about in the public and you don't want to have symptoms, don't do it when you got to do that. Maybe take it when you get home, or, take it earlier, to kind of adjust to your day, I guess. Okay. So I think we're almost out of time, and I don't see any new questions that came in. I hope this was helpful. I hope I answered all your questions to satisfactory levels. But yeah, I really appreciate it. I hope you guys stay well and have a good one.